Paris was still asleep when the body was found. A pale dawn struggled above the roofs of the Marais, brushing the mist that hung like breath over the cobblestones. Somewhere a milk cart rattled, and from a distant cafe came the sound of chairs being set out for the morning crowd. Yet in a narrow passage behind the Rue du Temple, a young patrolman stood frozen before what looked at first like a bundle of rags. It was a woman, her face turned toward the wall, her gloved hand outstretched as if she had tried to write something in the grime before falling. The faint smell of cheap perfume lingered, mingled with kerosene and the damp odor of the Seine. Within an hour, Maigret would arrive. Coat collar up, hat pulled low, his pipe clenched between his teeth. And the alley would fill with murmurs, the clicking of typewriters from the press van, the footsteps of curiosity. No one yet knew her name. No one knew why she had died alone, in a place where no respectable woman ever walked. But Paris has alleys that remember more than its boulevards, and in that morning fog, Maigret felt the weight of something older than crime, the faint echo of forgotten names whispering through the stones. If you find yourself drawn into the quiet persistence of Maigret, into the fog, the faces, the heavy silence of men who know too much, then stay a while. Light your own pipe, pour a coffee, and follow us through the investigation. Each clue leads deeper into a world where truth hides in the folds of ordinary life. And if you wish to walk beside the inspector through every case, every shadowed street, then subscribe, share the warmth, and come back to the light of the Quai des Orfèvres whenever you hear the faint hum of the Seine in your sleep. The morning had not yet decided whether to rise or to turn back into night. Paris, that strange creature of stone and vapour, lay curled beneath its blanket of fog, its breath damp and slow. Along the Rue du Temple, the lamps still burned a faint yellow, throwing blurred halos on the slick cobblestones. A cat darted between barrels behind a shuttered grocery, the only living soul until a gendarme's measured footsteps echoed between the walls. He had been sent by chance, a routine patrol, an early call from the commissariat, and he was young enough to still feel a shiver when the city offered silence instead of noise. He almost didn't see her. The shape in the passage seemed at first no more than discarded laundry, darkened by the night's rain. Then the beam of his lantern brushed the pale curve of a hand, gloved but damp, fingers half-curled as if reaching for help too late. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of kerosene, cold iron, and the faint sweetness of powder. He bent closer, holding his breath. The face was turned to the wall, hair dark and clinging to her temple, a small smear of rouge on her cheek, like a wound that had forgotten to bleed. The young man straightened slowly, feeling the world shrink until it was only this narrow space and the soft sound of dripping water from a broken gutter. By the time Maigret arrived, the sky had begun to grey. His overcoat steamed slightly in the chill, the collar turned high. The pipe between his teeth glowed faintly, each puff marking his rhythm of thought. Behind him, Lucas was already murmuring with the photographer, his voice muffled by the fog. The inspector crouched beside the body, his knees cracking softly, and stared for a long time without speaking. He didn't need to touch anything. The scene spoke enough. "She wasn't robbed," Lucas muttered. "Purses there, rings too." Maigret nodded absently. He noticed the shoes, scuffed but of good leather, and the hem of the dress, carefully mended. Working class, perhaps, but once proud. The perfume was faint now, something floral and cheap. He looked at the wall where her hand rested. In the grime, the fingers had traced the beginnings of a word. Or perhaps it was only coincidence. 3 blurred strokes like the letter M. He stood and gazed down the alley. It ended in a dead wall, the sort that absorbed every footstep and gave nothing back. A single street lamp leaned above, its glass cracked, humming with tired electricity. Beyond it, Paris continued to wake. The hiss of an early tram, a newspaper boy calling somewhere far off, the rattle of shutters. Maigret felt the weight of routine pressing against tragedy, life moving on, indifferent as always. A cafe owner emerged from the corner, apron tied hastily, curiosity stronger than fear. "You found her then?" he said, crossing himself. "Poor soul." "You knew her?" Maigret asked. His tone was mild, conversational, as though discussing the weather. "Not well. She came sometimes, sat by the window, coffee and nothing else. Always polite, never caused trouble." "How long ago?" "Yesterday morning, I think. Or was it the day before? Hard to say." She was quiet, that one. Maigret looked into the man's eyes, seeing not deceit, but the fog of memory. People rarely remembered with precision, they remembered with feeling. He took out his notebook, but didn't write. "And alone?" The man hesitated. "There was someone once, a gentleman with a fine umbrella. He came a few times. They didn't talk much, just sat. You could feel something between them, though. Not happiness. More like an ending." The inspector's gaze drifted toward the gutter, where water gathered in small, trembling pools. He had heard such words before. An ending, a gentleman, a quiet sadness. Paris was full of them. Still, something in the cafe owner's tone made him linger. He dismissed the man gently and signaled to Lucas. "Get a photographer for the hand, and tell Janvier to check the telegram office on Rue des Archives, see if any messages were sent around midnight." The body was lifted at last, the stretcher squeaking softly. Maigret followed as far as the street, then stopped beneath the archway, watching the fog absorb her shape. He didn't feel shock, only a quiet sorrow that settled in his chest like dust. These were the deaths that clung to him. Not the sensational ones that filled newspapers, but the lonely, anonymous endings no one claimed. He turned toward the cafe. The windows glowed now with morning light, reflecting his own silhouette. Broad, heavy, a man molded by routine, yet moved by things he could never quite explain. Inside, the warmth hit him like a whisper of normalcy. The air smelled of coffee, brandy, and fresh bread. He took a seat near the back, removed his hat, and signaled for a small calvados. The proprietor hesitated before pouring it, uncertain whether conversation was allowed. "You said she came often," Maigret began. "Did she ever speak of work?" The man shook his head. "No, but she carried herself like someone used to better times. Always with gloves, always looking at the clock." "Waiting for him, perhaps." "Perhaps," the man murmured. "Or for nothing at all." Maigret sipped slowly, eyes half closed. The cafe's mirror behind the counter showed the street outside, a blur of grey and gold. He thought of the hand, the half-written letter on the wall. It could be the beginning of a name, or a word, or a memory. He felt the pull of it, the small human gesture that transforms death into story. When he rose to leave, the cafe owner reached under the counter and handed him something wrapped in a napkin. "Found this near the doorway after you left last night," he said. "Didn't think much of it then?" It was a key, small and ornate, tied with a faded ribbon. On its metal surface, scratched faintly, were the letters RFB. Maigret turned it in his palm, feeling its cool weight. Rue des Francs Bourgeois, perhaps. He said nothing, only nodded and slipped it into his pocket. Outside, the fog had begun to thin, revealing the outlines of carriages and cyclists crossing the boulevard. The inspector lit his pipe again, drawing the smoke deep. Somewhere behind those walls, in a cheap rented room, lay the rest of the story. He felt the familiar rhythm begin, the quiet hunt, not for guilt, but for understanding. He walked slowly toward the Quai des Orfèvres, his coat brushing against the damp railings. The Seine moved below, patient and inscrutable. Every investigation began like this, a body, a question, and the faint pulse of a life that refused to disappear completely. He would find her name. He always did. At the corner, a newspaper boy shouted the morning's headline, "Minister Denis allegations in finance scandal." The words floated through the air like dust motes, meaningless yet persistent. Maigret paused, eyes narrowing, though he couldn't have said why. Perhaps it was nothing. Or perhaps, as often happened, one case was already walking hand in hand with another. He reached the quay and entered the familiar stone building where the smell of ink, tobacco, and damp coats wrapped around him like an old friend. The corridors were already buzzing with typewriters and the low voices of clerks. Lucas appeared, holding a report smudged with rain. "No identification yet," he said. "No papers, no handbag, but the coroner says she'd eaten only a roll and coffee, nothing else in her stomach." Maigret grunted softly. "Like someone who couldn't afford dinner." "Or who was waiting," Lucas replied. The inspector smiled faintly. "Yes, waiting." He took the report and glanced over the columns of observation. Bruising on the neck, time of death estimated between 1 and 3 in the morning, cause still uncertain. He handed it back and looked out the window toward the river, its surface already brightening. "Send a man to check the lodging houses near Rue des Francs Bourgeois," he said quietly, "and find out if any tenants gone missing since yesterday." Lucas nodded and left. Maigret remained still, pipe cooling in his hand. The name on the quay circled his thoughts like a gull above the water. Somewhere in that tangle of narrow streets, someone would open a door, expecting the wrong visitor. He leaned against the window frame, watching the mist lift from the river. The city was awake now, alive and unrepentant. The woman in the passage had vanished into the machinery of the day, but in the inspector's mind she remained, poised forever between breath and silence, her story demanding voice. And as the bells of Notre Dame began their first slow toll, Maigret felt it again. That faint stirring beneath the surface, the sense that the case before him was not merely an isolated death, but the beginning of something larger. Something that had been waiting for him, patiently, in the fog. The corner cafe had a way of catching the day before it properly began, like a fisherman who knew where the current slowed and turned. Its windows fogged from the inside, blurring the street to a watercolor. The doorbell's thin chime announced each arrival with the same weary cheer, and a draught of damp air followed every customer. Maigret stepped in and felt the closeness, the steam rising from cups, the smell of coffee cut with brandy, the sweet trace of yesterday's pastries reheated for today's hunger. The clock above the mirror showed 10 minutes past 7, a time that belonged to men who worked with their hands and to those who hadn't been to bed at all. The proprietor hovered behind the zinc counter, wiping as if cleanliness could repel misfortune. He had the heavy lids and red knuckles of a man who'd been awake too long. When he saw the inspector, he nodded, not in greeting, but in the resignation of someone who knew the day would not be ordinary. "Monsieur l'inspecteur," he said, and his voice tried to be brisk. "Coffee?" "Later," Maigret murmured, eyes travelling without hurry. The tables near the window were occupied by 2 carters with caps pulled low and a woman in a lilac scarf holding a newspaper She didn't read. In the corner, beside the small, upright piano, sat a thin man with a face like parchment and fingers already resting where the keys would be, as if music might be coaxed from the air by patience. The inspector let the room settle around him, the way he always did, until its temperature matched his breathing. "You said she often sat by the window," he said to the proprietor. "Always the same place?" "Nearly. There." The man's cloth pointed to the middle table, whose wooden edge bore a small crescent burn, likely from a careless match. She asked for the seat where she could see the street but not be seen from it. That's what I thought, at least. What did she drink? Coffee, sometimes a Calvados in the evening, but she took her time with it. She looked at the clock, and when she wasn't looking, she was listening. To footsteps, to the bell. One of those souls who count minutes as if they owed someone interest. Maigret went to the table and drew a chair back gently, as though the woman might return and chide him for moving it. He imagined her gloves, he had seen them, folded beside the cup, the saucer ringed with the brown trace of indecision. On the sill behind the curtain that hid the radiator, he found the ghost of a print left by something damp set there long enough to dry. An umbrella might leave such a mark in weather like this. He ran his finger across it and came away with dust. "What about him?" he asked, without turning. "The gentleman with the umbrella." The proprietor hesitated, then called over his shoulder. "Armand, you're early today. Play later. Tell monsieur what you told me." The piano man rose and approached with a mechanical grace. Up close he smelled faintly of tobacco and metal polish, and his eyes had that restless shine of one who watches faces for a living. "She liked the same tune," he said, tapping a rhythm on the table, 3 soft beats and a rest. "La petite Tonkinoise," slow, as if it were a lullaby. "Did she ask for it?" "Not with words. She put her coin on the piano and looked out, and I knew. When the gentleman came, I didn't play. Their silence had its own music." "Describe him." "Not tall. Grey felt hat, good quality. Shoes that had been resoled recently, quiet on the floor. His umbrella had a polished handle. Not silver, I think, but he kept a handkerchief in his pocket and wiped any mark anyway, like a man who needs to make order in small things because he has none in large ones. Age? 40, perhaps a little older. A civil servant, I'd have said, but perhaps that is because his collar was always properly starched, and his hands looked unused to rope or coal. He didn't smoke here, though he smelled of cigarettes he'd put out before coming in. How often? At first, twice a week, then less. The last time they didn't speak. She looked at the clock. He looked at the door. He left first. When was that? Armand's eyes darted to the clock as if it could rewind. A week? No, more. 10 days. It was raining then too, but the rain had warmth in it. Yesterday's had none. Maigret let silence lengthen. It was an instrument, and he knew how to play it. The piano man waited, uncertain if he'd given too much or too little. The inspector finally nodded toward the corner. "Do you recognize this?" He took the small key from his pocket and set it on the table, the faded ribbon trailing like a memory. The man studied it with an exaggerated care that told Maigret he had never seen it before. The proprietor drifted closer, his cloth forgotten. The woman with the lilac scarf glanced up, then away. It meant nothing to them, which was either the truth or a performance good enough to be truth's cousin. Maigret picked it up again and weighed it, not just in his hand, but against the room's temperature. No shift. The doorbell chimed, and in came a delivery boy with a basket of bread, cheeks pink from the cold. He stamped his shoes twice on the mat and hurried to the counter. The inspector watched him as one watches a leaf on a moving river. "You make your rounds early," he said softly when the boy had finished stacking loaves. "Always, monsieur," the boy said, eager to be noticed for something ordinary. "Saint-Paul, Rue du Temple. Then this corner. Same each day." "You see many faces." "Enough." "A woman, gloves even in fair weather, a scarf once blue, now faded, sat here in the mornings." "Did you see her yesterday?" The boy's brow furrowed, then smoothed. "Not yesterday. Day before, I think. She was here when I came at 7. She looked tired, but ladies always look tired in the morning. They have secrets at night." "Did she speak to you?" "Only to ask the time, twice. She didn't trust the clock, she said. It runs slow." Both men behind the counter turned as one to look at the clock, as if catching it in a small sin. Maigret followed their gaze. The hands trudged along with the obstinacy of old machinery, and if they lagged, it was because no one had the heart to wind them properly. A woman who didn't trust the clock would ask strangers for the hour. A woman waiting for something that was always late would come to despise minutes. "What about the telegram office?" Maigret asked the proprietor, as if remarking on the price of eggs. "There's one 2 streets over. Does anyone here send messages at night?" "At night?" The man shrugged. "We close before midnight, but people knock for matches and cigarettes. The girl—" He caught himself. "The woman, she stepped out once and returned with damp shoulders, as if she'd walked under the rain a moment. That was 3 nights ago. She left without finishing her coffee." He wrote nothing down. Paper was for report writing. Memory, for now, would do. He asked for coffee then and drank it black, the bitterness a sort of anchor. As he drank, he watched the mirror. Paris paraded in the glass, a policeman adjusting his collar, a seamstress with a bundle, a man who hesitated before the door and then thought better of courage. When the cup was empty, he placed a coin beneath it and stood. "Armand," he said at the door, "play La Petite Tonkinoise." Slowly. The man nodded and did as asked. The melody slipped into the room like a thing that had lived there for years, too polite to intrude and too stubborn to leave. Outside, the inspector paused beneath the awning and listened until he could no longer tell whether the music came from behind him or from his own recollection. Then he set off along the pavement, the key in his pocket, clicking softly against the coins like a discreet cough. He did not go straight to Rue des Francs Bourgeois. There was a woman with a lilac scarf who had left her newspaper folded on the table. People who leave papers unopened often read most carefully. He followed her at a distance, not stalking but trailing the way rain trails a carriage wheel, keeping pace without argument. She turned left, then right, and finally stopped at a tobacconist's, where a small queue had formed. When she left, she tucked the packet into her bag with a practised motion and crossed toward the little square by the church. Maigret closed the gap. "Madame," he said, in a tone polite enough to be irresistible. "You were at the café. Do you remember the woman who sometimes sat by the window?" The scarf tilted toward him, and beneath it a face not unkind, not brave either. "Everyone remembers her," she said, which was not an answer, but the threshold of one. "You saw her with a gentleman?" "Yes." "You noticed them. Why?" "Because they were quiet in a way that made the room quiet. And because once, when he stood to leave, she touched the edge of his sleeve as if to stop him, and he did not look at her hand. He took his umbrella and went out into the rain and did not open it." "Did she follow him?" "Not then. Another time, yes. She waited until he was half a street ahead, and then she went the same way, but with her head down. She had gloves always, I envied that. Gloves make hands private. Do you know where he went? Toward the river. I lost them near the bridge. Did anyone ever speak her name in your hearing? The woman hesitated, the way a person does when a word floats just beyond reach. Only once. The proprietor said something like, Mademoiselle, and then another word I didn't catch. It began with M as well, I think. Or maybe I only think so because of how he said Mademoiselle. It leaves the mouth in the same shape. He thanked her and did not press. Names, when they wished to be found, had their own ways of stepping from the shadows. He returned to the cafe long enough to pay for the coffee he hadn't ordered earlier and, with a nod, left again. The air had thinned, the fog unravelling into strands that clung to gutters and vanished above chimney pots. He headed toward Rue des Archives, the heels of his shoes counting off his thoughts. At the corner, he paused to watch a street sweeper coax rainwater into a grate with a brush that had seen better years. The city smelled clean in patches and gutter-borne in others. He passed the telegram office and glanced at the ledger through the open hatch. Behind it, a clerk with a pencil moustache frowned at forms. "We're not open till 8, the man called defensively. "I'll return," Maigret said, and he would, but his feet had already decided to take him elsewhere. He turned instead into the tangle that led to Rue des Francs Bourgeois, where rooms were cheap and iron staircases clanged when someone came home too late. The key in his pocket warmed to his body and felt as though it had been meant to live there. Yet before he reached the street's mouth, he stopped. A man with a grey felt hat came out of a doorway ahead, paused to check the sky, and drew a polished-handled umbrella from under his arm without opening it. He hesitated, the smallest of hesitations, and then set off toward the river with that careful speed of men who believe they are unobserved. His shoes were newly resoled. They made almost no sound. Maigret did not follow him at once. He looked instead at the doorway from which the man had emerged. Above it, a battered brass plate read in faded letters, "Rooms, week or month." A little below, someone had scratched initials so shallow they were almost wishful. RFB. The inspector's gaze returned to the moving figure at the far end of the street. A choice presented itself, not dramatic, as choices rarely are, but with the gentle pressure of inevitability. The river or the room? The man with the umbrella or the lock the key might fit? He felt, not for the first time, that Paris enjoyed these small jokes at his expense. He turned his collar up and stood very still, listening to the city's breath. Then he slipped the key between his fingers and made his way to the door with the brass plate, where the smell of boiled potatoes and old varnish waited like a memory that had not learned to fade. The key fit the lock with the soft reluctance of something that hadn't been turned in days. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the mingled odours of damp fabric, cold ashes, and a faint perfume that had once tried to mask both. Maigret paused in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. A thin strip of light bled through the shutters, tracing the narrow room in pale strokes. A washstand stood against the wall, a chipped mirror above it reflecting a ghost of movement, his own, large and steady, as if the room itself had been waiting for him to enter. It was the kind of lodging that offered no comfort beyond a roof and four walls, yet tried to suggest decency with a vase of artificial flowers and a lace doily turning brown at the edges. A small stove crouched in the corner beside a single armchair whose stuffing bulged at one arm. On the mantel stood a clock that had stopped at 11:15. He made a note of the time without knowing why. In rooms like this, the stopped clock was never innocent. He closed the door behind him and lit a match. The flame trembled briefly, showing him the outlines of a narrow bed, neatly made, but unslept in. He moved closer, noticing the indentation on the pillow, the faint curve where a head had lain days ago. A hair, dark, fine, clung to the linen. He picked it up, studied it in the light, and let it fall. The air was motionless enough that it took a long time to reach the floor. On the table lay a folded letter, its envelope unsealed, the handwriting small and deliberate. It was addressed only with a name. Henri. No surname. Inside, a few lines written in haste, the ink smudged where tears or rain had touched it. You must not come again. They are watching. It is better for both of us. I will send word when I can breathe again. There was no signature, only the impression of a hand pressing down too hard at the final word, as though the act of writing had cost more than the message itself. Maigret read it twice, then placed it carefully back where he had found it. He walked to the dresser. A comb, a pair of earrings missing their stones, a small bottle of cheap scent labelled fleur-de-lis. Next to them lay a photograph, a young man in a sailor's cap standing on a dock, one hand raised in half a wave. The edges were worn from handling. The name of the photographer's studio was printed on the back, Le Havre. The inspector frowned. The sea had a way of haunting lives in Paris. Men came from it, left for it, disappeared into it. It lent women the kind of waiting that could stretch across years, the kind that ended in alleys. He pocketed the photograph and turned toward the wardrobe. The doors creaked as he opened them. Inside hung a single coat, thin for the season, and beneath it a small suitcase half filled with clothes folded with care. At the bottom, wrapped in newspaper, was a pair of shoes still damp from recent wear. He crouched and ran his hand along the floorboards. Dust rose, but beneath it he found the mark of something dragged, a small rectangle where the boards were lighter. He tapped gently with his knuckle and heard the hollow echo of space beneath. Using his pocket knife, he pried the board loose. Beneath it lay a packet of letters tied with ribbon the colour of old blood. He didn't open them, not yet. Instead, he sat in the armchair and lit his pipe. Smoke drifted upward, mingling with the dim light. The letters could wait until he understood the room. The rhythm of the investigation was not in haste, but in observation. He looked again at the objects around him, everything chosen, nothing random. Even poverty, when neat, carried intention. Whoever she was, she had tried to maintain order in a life that no longer obeyed it. A knock sounded on the door. Lucas's voice came through, low but urgent. Found the landlord patron. Says the tenant paid in advance till the end of the week. Did he know her? He says no. Rented under the name Mademoiselle Renard. Paid cash. Never caused trouble. Had one visitor, a man. Didn't see his face clearly, but he carried an umbrella even when it wasn't raining. Maigret's eyes went to the photograph on the dresser. And before that? She was here about 3 months, according to him. Came from nowhere. Said she worked as a typist. No papers, no reference. Quiet. The inspector stood and opened the door. The corridor outside smelled of cabbage and floor polish. Tell the landlord to wait downstairs. I'll speak to him. Lucas hesitated. There's one more thing. The concierge from next door came by. Says a telegram arrived 3 nights ago. No sender's name, just the words, "Meet me where it began." Maigret's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes flickered. And she went out that night? Yes. He nodded slowly, turning back toward the room. Bring the telegram to the office and send Janvier to check the shipping registers at Le Havre for anyone named Henri who served in the last 5 years. Lucas left, the sound of his steps fading down the stairs. Maigret lingered a moment longer, letting the silence close around him. The room was talking now, softly, in its own language. The stopped clock, the empty bed, the letter unsigned. It spoke of fear restrained by dignity, of a woman who had prepared herself for disappearance, as one prepares for sleep. He rose and opened the window. The air outside was sharp, filled with the smell of wet stone. Across the courtyard, laundry hung stiff on a line, forgotten. A cat watched him from a sill opposite, its eyes gleaming. Paris stretched beyond, a labyrinth of stories waiting to repeat themselves. He turned back inside, gathered the packet of letters, and slipped them into his coat. As he left, he noticed for the first time a small stain on the edge of the table. Not blood, not wine, but candle wax, pale and hardened. He touched it lightly, as if expecting warmth. Outside, the stairwell groaned with every step. The landlord waited at the foot, a man with the suspicious humility of those who make a living from the misfortunes of others. "She paid on time," he insisted, before Maigret could speak. "Quiet, clean, you wouldn't have known she was here." "You didn't ask questions?" "I don't ask. People don't like questions when they rent rooms. Some come for work, some to hide, some because they've been left behind. I don't make it my concern which." "Did she ever receive visitors besides the man?" "Only the postman, once a letter from Le Havre, I think. She smiled when she saw the stamp." "And this man, did you hear them argue?" The landlord hesitated, eyes darting to the floor. "One night, not shouting, words said quietly but with sharpness, like a knife drawn too slowly. After that she stopped singing. I used to hear her hum while washing. She stopped." Maigret thanked him, though the man didn't seem to deserve gratitude. He stepped outside into the street. The fog of the morning had lifted, leaving the air bright and cold. He stood for a moment, pipe in hand, feeling the weight of the city press close. Somewhere nearby, a bell was ringing noon. He began to walk toward the Seine, the letters in his pocket rustling faintly. He thought of the words in the unposted note. "I will send word when I can breathe again." But the woman in the alley had never breathed again. And perhaps that had been her choice, or perhaps it had been taken from her. In Maigret's world, choice and fate were often twins, difficult to tell apart until it was too late. At the corner of the street, a boy with ink-stained fingers was selling evening editions even though it was barely midday. "Scandal widened in ministry," he cried. "Secret mistress feared dead." Maigret stopped. The wind caught the pages and flapped them like wings. He bought one, scanning the columns, but the name he sought was not there. Still the story carried a familiar smell, of officials, of money, of women silenced by discretion. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it inside his coat beside the letters. When he reached the river, he leaned on the stone parapet and watched the current slide by. It was neither fast nor slow, merely inevitable. He thought of the photograph again. The sailor, the half-wave. Perhaps Henri had returned. Perhaps he had never left. The packet of letters might tell him, but for now he preferred not to know. There was something sacred in uncertainty, something that kept compassion alive. He turned toward the office, his figure broad against the pale light, and the wind carried a few leaves down the quay. Somewhere behind him, a clock struck 12:15. The same moment, perhaps, when the clock in the little room had chosen to stop. Maigret did not look back. He rarely did. The city would keep its secrets until he returned, and when he did, it would yield just enough truth to make him wish for less. The river had always been a confidant to Maigret. It carried the city's secrets with the patience of something ancient, indifferent to who lived or died along its banks. That afternoon, the Seine rolled grey and full, swollen from days of mist and rain, its slow undulations catching the dull light like pewter. From the window of his office, Maigret watched a barge drift beneath the Pont Neuf, its wake folding against the embankment in rhythmic sighs. Somewhere below, a gull cried once and was swallowed by the hum of traffic on the bridge. Paris, as always, went about its business, while tragedy ripened quietly in the corners no one saw. The reports were spread before him, thin as communion wafers, each one promising truth and delivering only fragments. The telegram clerk had confirmed a message sent 3 nights earlier to a Mademoiselle Renard. Cash payment, no return address. Janvier's note from Le Havre was less certain. 3 men named Henri listed among the port's registry, 2 of them deserters, 1 dead. The photograph he had taken from the room now lay on the desk beside his cooling pipe, its surface dulled by fingerprints. The sailor in it smiled as if the world were still kind. Maigret leaned back, exhaling slowly. He wasn't tired, not yet. It was the waiting that dulled him. The investigation had reached that delicate stage where facts existed but refused to align, where every truth held its opposite. He had learned long ago that haste was the enemy of understanding. He rose, took his hat, and stepped into the corridor, where the smell of tobacco, ink, and damp wool hung thick in the air. By the time he reached the quay, twilight had begun its descent. The lamps were already lit, halos trembling in the damp. The inspector's breath came in pale clouds as he walked, his hands deep in his pockets. He followed the embankment past bookstores and shuttered kiosks until the street names changed and the city's pulse slowed. It was near the Pont Marie, where the Seine narrowed and the fog gathered like a curtain, that he found what he was looking for. A warehouse leaned against the river's edge, its stones dark with moss. Its door was unmarked except for a faint number and the scuff of recent boots. Inside, the air was colder than the street, thick with the smell of rope and wet burlap. He heard voices before he saw their owners, low, cautious, threaded with the music of the docks. A group of men sat around a stove improvised from a barrel, cards in hand, the smoke from their pipes curling toward the rafters. When Maigret appeared, conversation shrank into silence. "Good evening, gentlemen," he said mildly, removing his hat. "I'm looking for someone who might have seen a woman near here 3 nights ago, dark hair, gloves, alone." The men exchanged glances. One spat into the ashes. "Plenty of women pass this way, monsieur. Not all of them have reasons they'd care to share." "Perhaps," said Maigret, lighting his pipe. "But this one had reason enough to die." That silenced even the shuffling of cards. The inspector let the weight of the words settle before continuing. "She may have spoken to someone. She may have been waiting." At last, a man with a dockman's shoulders and a sailor's beard leaned forward. "I seen one, maybe her. Tuesday night. Stood by the river wall, looking down at the water. Didn't move for a long time. Thought she might throw herself in, so I watched. Then a man came, well-dressed, umbrella under his arm. They talked. He gestured toward the bridge. She shook her head. Then he walked off, quick. She stayed a while, then left the other way." "Did they argue?" "Not loud, but she looked like she'd been crying before he came. Hard to tell in the fog, though. Everything looks like tears in that weather." "Could you describe him?" "Hat. Coat like yours, only lighter. Umbrella with a shiny handle. Walked like a man who's used to hallways, not cobblestones." Maigret gave a small nod. "Thank you." He reached into his pocket and produced a few francs, which the man refused, with a shake of his head. "Keep your money, monsieur. Just find out why she looked at the river that way." Outside, the fog thickened again, rising from the water like breath from a wound. The inspector walked to the low wall and leaned against it, pipe glowing faintly in the dusk. The river's surface was black now, reflecting the lamps in broken chains of light. He imagined her standing there, Mademoiselle Renard, if that had ever been her real name, staring into the dark as though searching for something that could only be found beneath it. He had seen that look before, in widows, in men returned from war, in children left too long in silence. It was the gaze of those who had made peace with loss. Footsteps echoed behind him. He turned slightly. Lucas approached, collar turned up against the chill, his breath quick. "Patron, we've traced the umbrella." Maigret raised an eyebrow. "You have?" "A repair shop on Rue Saint-Antoine. They recognized the description. Silver handle, initials engraved. CG, it was brought in last week for recovering. Picked up 2 days ago by a man matching the cafe witness's account. Name? None given. Paid cash." Maigret resumed his walk along the quay, Lucas falling into step beside him. "CG," he murmured. "Could be anything. A name, a title, an alias. But men who have umbrellas repaired rather than replaced usually have habits, not wealth." They stopped near a lamp-post where the mist shimmered gold. Did the repairman remember anything else? He said the man's voice was quiet, educated, foreign perhaps. Belgian, he thought. "Belgian," Maigret repeated softly, his pipe smoke mingling with the fog. "So close, yet always just a little apart." He smiled faintly, almost to himself. "You know, Lucas, the river teaches patience. It doesn't demand the truth. It waits for it." Lucas looked puzzled, but didn't reply. They turned back toward the bridge. As they walked, Maigret's eyes caught a flicker of movement near the steps, descending to the riverbank, a silhouette hunched in the shadows. He signaled for silence and moved closer. The figure turned out to be a boy, no more than 12, with a bundle of newspapers under his arm. "You're out late," Maigret said. The boy jumped. "Deliveries, monsieur, evening papers for the barges." "Did you see a woman here the night before last, or a man with an umbrella?" The boy thought hard, chewing his lip. "I saw a lady, yes. She stood right where you are. I thought she might be waiting for someone, but then she dropped something into the water. I heard it splash, then she walked away quick." "What did she drop?" The boy shrugged. "Could have been anything, but I heard metal, not big, like a key maybe." Maigret felt the echo of the object still in his pocket, the small key from the cafe. For a moment, the cold bit deeper. "You're sure?" The boy nodded. "I remember because I leaned over to see if it floated, but it was gone." He gave the boy a coin and dismissed him. The river lapped softly against the stone, indifferent, eternal. Somewhere beneath those black ripples, perhaps the other half of the mystery lay. What she had meant to hide or to lose forever. They climbed back up the steps. The inspector didn't speak until they reached the street. "Lucas," he said finally, "tomorrow find out if anyone named CG works or used to work at the Ministry of Finance." Quietly. "You think the scandals in the papers have something to do with her?" Maigret's answer came slow, deliberate. "In Paris, the difference between a scandal and a murder is often just the size of the audience." They walked in silence until the lights of the Quai des Orfèvres came into view, gleaming on the wet cobblestones. Inside, Maigret removed his coat and hat and sat heavily at his desk. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. He took out the letters from the woman's room and untied the ribbon. The handwriting was the same as in the unfinished note. Small, trembling, disciplined. He read through them one by one, the story emerging like a photograph in developing fluid. A love begun in secrecy, a promise of escape, the slow corrosion of hope. The last letter was unsigned, its words almost a confession. "You once said the river would forgive us. I'm going to ask it whether that was true." Maigret folded the letter carefully and stared out the window. The fog pressed against the glass, making the world beyond seem softer, unreachable. Somewhere outside the Seine kept flowing, carrying its burden of names whispered and forgotten. He didn't notice the hour passing, only the faint click of his pipe cooling. When at last he rose to leave, dawn was threatening the horizon again, grey and uncertain. And as he stepped into the cold corridor, he realized he was beginning to understand. The river hadn't just witnessed the crime, it had been part of it, an accomplice to the silence. By morning, the city seemed cleaner, though Maigret knew that was only an illusion. Rain had washed the streets, but not the stains that lived beneath them. From the window of his apartment, he watched the small stream of workers crossing Boulevard Richard-Lenoir, their umbrellas bobbing like patient beetles. Madame Maigret had already set the breakfast table, coffee, bread, a jar of plum jam. She moved quietly, as she always did when he was deep in a case, her eyes following him with the worried tenderness of someone who had learned long ago that silence was the best way to help. He ate little, his thoughts elsewhere. The initials on the umbrella, CG, had gnawed at him through the night like a tune he couldn't name. In the dim light of dawn, he had gone over the letters again, searching for anything that matched, a reference, a habit, a clue disguised as affection. But there was nothing, just the quiet ache of two people who had wanted to run from something or toward it. When he reached the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas was waiting, coat still dripping from the rain. "We found him, patron," he said, before Maigret could hang his hat. "Well, who?" "The man with the umbrella, or at least someone who fits him as if tailored, Charles Gallet, former clerk at the Ministry of Finance, dismissed 6 months ago for irregularities. He's been living in a small flat on Rue Traversière, registered under his own name but keeping to himself. No record since his dismissal, no family in Paris." "Gallet," Maigret repeated softly. "And the initials match." "They do." Maigret's face gave nothing away, but a faint current stirred behind his eyes. He nodded once. "Let's pay Monsieur Gallet a visit." The street was narrow and lined with modest buildings that smelled of boiled potatoes and old varnish. They climbed 2 flights, each step creaking as if protesting intrusion. At the top, Lucas knocked. The door opened after a pause. A man stood there, hatless, his hair streaked with grey, though he could not have been more than 45. His clothes were neat but tired, his collar frayed, and his eyes, calm, deliberate, took in Maigret's badge without surprise. "Inspector," he said quietly, as if the word had been waiting on his tongue. "I thought you might come." The room behind him was clean, almost painfully so. Papers stacked in perfect order on the desk, curtains drawn halfway to keep the morning from feeling too bright. On a chair near the stove rested the umbrella, silver handle polished, fabric still damp from use. Maigret entered without invitation, motioning Lucas to wait outside. He removed his hat and set it on the table, then took out his pipe and filled it with the slow precision of ritual. "You knew Mademoiselle Renard," he said. A flicker, barely visible, crossed Gallet's face. "I knew a woman who used that name. I suppose she doesn't need it anymore." "You're well informed." "I read the papers." Her death was not in the papers. For the first time, the man looked directly at him. "Then I suppose I was expecting it?" The silence that followed was not tense, merely human. Maigret studied him as he might a photograph, angles, posture, the small betrayals of fatigue. You were dismissed from your post, he said. There was talk of missing funds. There was talk of many things. Were they true? Gallet smiled faintly. Does it matter? The ministry prefers silence to scandal. They let me disappear, provided I made no noise. I took their offer. And she? She believed she could save me. That we could start again somewhere the air was cleaner. She didn't understand that men like me don't get to start again. Maigret drew on his pipe, the smoke curling upward between them. You met her near the river. Yes. Why? To say goodbye? Did she drop something into the water? He hesitated. A key, I told her to. It was symbolic. Of what? Of forgetting. She wanted to keep it, but I insisted. It belonged to the room she rented. I paid for it once when things were better. I didn't want her to go back there again. She went back anyway, Maigret said softly. You know that now. The man's eyes closed briefly. I thought she would, but I hope not. You argued. Yes. About what? About Mercy. Whose? He looked up then, and in his expression was something almost tender. Hers. She wanted to confess, to tell someone what had happened at the ministry. I asked her not to. It would have destroyed more lives than mine. Maigret leaned forward. Destroyed or revealed? Both, Gallet said simply. The inspector let the answer rest between them. Outside the rain had begun again, tapping the window in irregular rhythm. You said you read the papers, Maigret murmured. You must have noticed the scandal they're whispering about. Names withheld, of course. Yes, said Gallet, they always are. And you? You were one of them? Gallet smiled, but it was not a confession. I was a clerk, Inspector. Clerks carry the secrets of other men. When those men need to disappear the evidence, they make sure the clerk disappears too. Was she your accomplice? She was my conscience. Maigret exhaled slowly, pipe smoke drifting toward the ceiling. Conscience is a dangerous companion. It asks too many questions. Gallet nodded, and never stops listening. They sat without speaking for a while, the sound of the rain filling the silence. Maigret studied the man's hands. They were steady. No tremor of guilt, no nervous twitch. He wasn't lying. Or perhaps he had lied so long that truth had become indistinguishable from memory. When did you last see her? The night she died. And after she walked away? I followed her for a while. I wanted to be sure she reached home safely. She turned toward Rue du Temple. I watched her disappear into the fog. I never saw her again. You didn't go after her? No. Maigret rose, heavy but deliberate, and walked to the window. Below, a cart rumbled past, leaving a ribbon of water in its wake. He turned back. You understand, Monsieur Gallet, that your story, however poetic, will not suffice for the coroner. I know. You may have to come with us. I expected that too. As Maigret reached for his hat, his eyes fell once more on the umbrella resting near the stove. He lifted it, examining the polished handle. The initials gleamed faintly. C.G. A fine piece, he said. A gift? Gallet's mouth tightened. No, a souvenir. From whom? From a man who no longer needs it. Dead? Not yet. Their eyes met. A long, wordless exchange. Maigret set the umbrella down again, almost gently. You understand that if you're lying, I'll find out. I'm not lying, Inspector, Gallet said. I've simply run out of truths. They left him sitting in his chair, the faint crackle of the stove the only sound behind them. On the stairway, Lucas waited, his face clouded. You think he did it? Maigret shook his head. No, but he knows who did, and for reasons of his own he intends to protect them. They stepped into the street. The rain had turned fine, almost delicate, blurring the edges of things. Across the way, a man folded a newspaper and slipped it under his coat before walking quickly out of sight. Maigret's gaze followed him, but he didn't move. "Keep a watch on Gallet," he said, quietly. "He's the kind who makes decisions at night." By evening, the fog had returned, thick enough to soften even the glow of the lamps. Maigret sat in his office once more. The city's murmur filtered through the window. He read the last of the letters again, one line repeating itself like a refrain. "If they ask, tell them I never wanted forgiveness." He set the page aside, stared at the reflection of his own face in the glass, and murmured to no one, "You'll have it anyway." The clock struck 9. Somewhere beyond the river, a bell answered. The man with the umbrella had walked into the fog, and Maigret, though he didn't yet know it, was walking after him, toward a truth that would not stop at one death. By the next morning, Paris was glazed with rain. The gutters murmured like half-asleep rivers, and carriages passed in slow procession, wheels whispering over wet stone. Maigret left the Quai des Orfèvres before sunrise, his coat buttoned to the throat, hat pulled low. He carried no case file, only the umbrella that wasn't his, Gallet's, borrowed, on the pretext of evidence, though it served more as company than proof. Its polished handle glinted whenever a street lamp caught it, like an eye that refused to close. The train to Saint-Cloud smelled of coal and wet wool. The inspector sat alone in a compartment, watching fields blur into a dull green smear beyond the window. The countryside always felt like an intrusion after days in Paris, too open, too frank. But the address in his notebook demanded this journey, a villa on the outskirts, registered under Madame Gallet, wife of the disgraced clerk. The letterhead from one of the woman's unanswered correspondences had given it away. Fine paper, expensive ink, the neat, restrained hand of a woman taught to hide feeling in form. At the station, he hailed a carriage, though the horse looked as weary as its driver. "Rue de l'Aurore," Maigret said, and the driver, half asleep beneath his cap, flicked the reins. The road climbed through mist and rain until the houses began to thin, and the river fell away behind. The villa stood behind iron gates, overgrown with ivy, its shutters closed, though smoke rose from the chimney. A maid answered the bell, narrow-shouldered, timid, her eyes flickering at the sight of his badge. "Madame is not receiving visitors." "She will receive me." The woman hesitated, then led him through a narrow hall, smelling faintly of violets and neglect. The carpet muffled his steps. Portraits of ancestors stared down, their eyes clouded with dust. In the drawing-room, the light was dim, filtered through lace curtains. A woman sat near the fire, her back straight, her hands folded over a letter she had been pretending not to read. Madame Gallet. She looked up. Her face was pale, drawn tight by sleeplessness. Beneath the perfection of her hair and the subtle elegance of her dress lay something brittle, a life cracked by restraint. "Inspector," she said softly, "I wondered when you would come." "You expected me?" She gestured toward the empty chair opposite her. "My husband wrote that the police had questions. He writes when he's frightened. He always did." Maigret took the seat. "You've heard about the woman found dead in Paris?" Her fingers tightened around the letter. "Yes." "She used the name Mademoiselle Renard." "I know." The inspector said nothing. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Finally she spoke again, her voice low and precise. "I am not cruel, Inspector. I knew about her long before the papers whispered. When a man begins to vanish from his own life, A wife notices. I chose not to ask. But there is a difference between silence and forgiveness. And which did you choose? She looked into the fire. Neither. I waited. It's what women do best, isn't it? We wait until the truth tires of hiding. Maigret studied her quietly. Your husband says she wanted to confess about the ministry, but about the scandal. A faint smile touched her lips, almost pitying. He would say that. It makes him noble. But she wasn't thinking of corruption or money. She was thinking of him. She believed she could save him as though love were a kind of exorcism. You speak as though you knew her. I did, once. That startled even him. You met? She came here, uninvited, of course, but very polite. She wanted to see where he lived, or rather, where he used to live. She said she needed to understand what she was replacing. She stood in this very room. It was raining then, too. She wore gloves. When was this? 2 months ago? And what did you say to her? I told her that men like Charles don't belong to anyone for long. Not to a mistress, not to a wife, not even to themselves. They belong to whatever they fear most. For him, it was failure. Maigret leaned forward slightly. Did you tell your husband she came? No, I didn't have to. He knew. They always know. The fire crackled softly, the only sound. Maigret's gaze drifted to the mantel, where framed photographs stood in perfect alignment. One caught his eye, Charles Gallet in younger days, uniformed, holding a walking stick with a silver handle. The same polished curve gleamed faintly in the photo's sepia light. That umbrella, Maigret murmured. It was yours, wasn't it? She looked up, startled by the gentleness of the question. It was a wedding gift, she said after a pause. From my father. Charles took it when he left. I never asked for it back. And now? Her voice thinned. Now it's like everything else between us, returned too late to matter. Maigret nodded, the pipe in his pocket, unlit, but warm beneath his fingers. Tell me, madame, did you see your husband the night of the murder? I did not, but I dreamed of him, which is almost worse. In the dream he was standing by the river, holding the umbrella closed, though the rain was falling hard. When I woke, I knew something had ended. He believed her, not because of the words, but because of how she said them, as one who had long since made peace with loss. If he were to be arrested, he said gently, would you protect him? Her eyes met his then, clear and steady. I already did, Inspector, for 10 years. Once is enough. He rose slowly. Thank you for your honesty. As he turned to go, she stopped him. Inspector, do you think he killed her? I think he loved her in a way that frightened him, Maigret said. And frightened people do desperate things. Outside, the rain had slackened to a whisper. He walked back down the gravel path, the grey sky pressing low over the trees. Somewhere in the garden a fountain gurgled, its sound small and broken. He thought of the 2 women, one alive but hollowed by years of waiting, the other dead but still lingering in every conversation. Between them stood Gallet, neither innocent nor wicked, merely human. At the station, Maigret lit his pipe at last, the smoke curling around him like thought made visible. He could still hear her voice. They always know. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps Gallet had known that morning what fate awaited by the river. Perhaps he had gone there not to meet her, but to make certain she would never speak again. But something in him resisted that simplicity. Murder, in his experience, was rarely tidy. It was a disorder born of love, fear, money, or pride, but always of loneliness. And Gallet's loneliness had a different texture, too composed, too practiced. Back in Paris, the evening light had begun to fade when he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres. Lucas met him at the entrance, waving a telegram. From the ministry, patron. They confirm Gallet's dismissal, but there's more. The investigation into the missing funds was reopened this morning. Someone's been asking for the old files. Who? They won't say. Maigret's brow furrowed. The timing was too neat. And Gallet? Under surveillance, hasn't left his flat. But there was a visitor this afternoon. Man in a chauffeur's coat, left an envelope. Maigret took the telegram, folded it once, and slipped it into his pocket beside the borrowed umbrella. Have Janvier bring me the name of every senior official tied to that old inquiry. I want to know who has the most to lose. As he climbed the stairs to his office, the thought followed him like an echo. They always know. The words clung to the rhythm of his steps. By the time he reached his desk, the fog had thickened outside again, blurring the lamps along the quay. He stood by the window a long while, watching the river reclaim its shadows. In the glass reflection, his face appeared twice, once solid, once fading, and he thought, not for the first time, how close understanding often was to illusion. He reached for the umbrella, turned the silver handle once, and saw his own distorted reflection in it. A man searching for truth in a world built on careful lies. Then quietly, he said to the empty room, "If the river forgives, it's only because it remembers too much." The clock struck 10. Somewhere across the city, a door opened, and the story began to move again. The next morning dawned sharp and colourless, a light that flattened everything it touched. Paris felt brittle after the rain, its puddles glazed with a thin film that caught the first weak sun. At the corner, kiosks, the newspapers were already stacked, headlines bleeding into one another. Scandal deepens in ministry. Anonymous sources claim cover-up. Inspector General resigns. The names were redacted, the details vague, but Maigret could read between the lines. The press was circling something it didn't yet understand, like dogs sniffing a scent beneath the pavement. He bought a copy from a boy who recognized him. "Everyone's talking about it, monsieur," the boy said. "They say someone in the police is involved." "Do they?" Maigret murmured, folding the paper neatly under his arm. "Then they're talking too early." He walked toward the Quai des Orfèvres, the river flashing briefly under the bridges like a blade turned in sunlight. Inside, the building hummed with voices, the kind of low, feverish noise that came when rumour had outrun fact. Lucas was waiting by the office door, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. "Patron, you've seen the papers?" "I have." "They're naming no one, but the implication is there, the missing funds, the ministry men, someone leaked it." Maigret hung his hat on the peg, laid the folded newspaper on the desk, and sat. "Leaks have purpose, Lucas. The question is who benefits." Lucas stubbed out his cigarette, eyes dark with worry. "If they connect Gallet to it." "They will, that's the intention." "You think he's being framed?" "I think he's being used. Whether by those he once served or those who fear him now, I can't yet tell." He opened the newspaper and began to read, slowly, savouring the deliberate evasions. The writing was careful, too careful, as though the journalists had been handed just enough information to believe they were uncovering a secret, while, in truth, they were serving as messengers for someone else's version of events. Names were replaced by initials, dates were suggestive but incomplete. Yet one paragraph caught his attention. Sources close to the investigation have suggested that a female intermediary may have been in possession of compromising documents prior to her death in unexplained circumstances near the Rue du Temple. Maigrè's pipe remained unlit in his hand. "Compromising documents," he said softly. "They've turned her into a courier." Lucas frowned. "Then the story's spreading faster than we can contain it." "Containment is for men who still believe they can manage truth." He folded the paper carefully and set it aside. "Find out which journalist wrote this piece. I want his editor's name, and I want to know who paid for his dinner last night." Lucas grinned faintly, the kind of grin that hid admiration beneath concern. "Understood, patron." He slipped out, leaving the office quiet except for the ticking of the clock and the muted hum from the corridor. Maigret leaned back, staring at the smoke-stained ceiling. He had seen it before, how stories metastasized, how power disguised itself as information. A woman dies, and suddenly her death becomes useful. The press prints what the public craves: scandal dressed as justice, mystery as distraction. Meanwhile, the truth grows smaller, more fragile, until it hides behind the noise like a shy animal. He rose and crossed to the window. The river was visible through the mist, dull and relentless. He thought again of Galette sitting in that immaculate room, his calm voice, his certainty that others were pulling the strings. The umbrella still leaned against Maigret's desk, its handle catching the light like a quiet accusation. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Janvier entered, carrying a stack of telegraphs. Messages from the ministry, patron, and something else. A journalist waiting downstairs, a Monsieur Delorme from Le Matin, says he wants to clarify a few details before publishing his follow-up. Maigret smiled faintly. Clarify? That's a new word for it. He adjusted his tie and took up the umbrella. Send him in. The journalist was young, elegant in the way that comes from borrowed confidence. He carried a notebook but hadn't yet opened. "Inspector Maigret," he began, offering a polite smile. "I'm grateful you agreed to see me. I know how busy you must be." "You're right," Maigret said, sitting behind the desk. "So let's not waste time. Who gave you this?" He tapped the folded newspaper with one finger. Delorme's smile faltered. "I'm afraid I can't reveal sources." "Of course you can't. But sources have addresses and addresses have neighbors. You were seen leaving the Café Cardinal last night at 10. The man you were with, tall, grey coat, ministry accent, what did he tell you?" The journalist blinked. "He said there was evidence of blackmail, that the woman, your victim, was holding letters that could ruin a senior official. He said she meant to sell them abroad." "Did he show you these letters?" "No, but—" Then he lied. Delorme's face reddened. "Inspector, I'm only doing my job." Maigret leaned forward, his eyes soft but heavy. "Your job, Monsieur Delorme, is to make noise. Mine is to listen through it. But let me warn you, if you keep repeating what you don't understand, you'll find yourself echoing a confession that belongs to someone else." The journalist swallowed hard. "Are you saying the ministry's hiding something?" "I'm saying they always are." When the man had gone, Maigret sat for a long moment, staring at the closed door. The air smelled faintly of ink and nervous sweat. He reached for the pipe again and finally lit it. Smoke filled the room, slow and grey, curling upward like a second fog. He thought of Madame Gallet at Saint-Cloud, her composure like porcelain, her knowledge sharp enough to cut. He thought of Charles Gallet, still under watch, perhaps realizing how close the noose had drawn. And above them all, the faceless men who manipulated both justice and rumour with equal ease. By noon, Lucas returned. Delorme's dinner was paid for by a man named Roussel, attachés to the Minister of Finance, and the same man has been asking questions about you, patron. "About me?" Lucas nodded. "Word is, they're saying you're obstructing the case, that you've gone soft, too sympathetic to your suspects." Maigret smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. They mistake patience for softness. That's the trouble with men who've never listened to silence. He rose, took his coat, and headed for the door. We're going to the ministry. The building on Rue de Rivoli was as imposing as ever. Tall marble columns, corridors that smelled of dust and secrecy. The clerk at the reception desk paled at the sight of Maigret's badge, but said nothing. Upstairs, behind double doors, the minister's office waited, its grandeur dulled by years of smoke and self-importance. The minister himself stood by the window, a stout man with careful eyes. "Inspector," he said without turning, "I'm told you've been asking questions best left." "Unasked?" "That depends," Maigret said. "Sometimes the best questions are the quiet ones. You're interfering with an internal matter." "I'm investigating a murder." The minister faced him then, his expression smooth as glass. "And I'm telling you that the woman's death, tragic as it is, bears no relevance to government affairs." Maigret studied him for a long moment. "Then why did one of your attachés pay a journalist to imply the opposite?" A muscle twitched at the corner of the man's jaw. "You're treading on dangerous ground, Inspector." "Dangerous ground is where bodies are buried." They held each other's gaze until the silence thickened. Finally, Maigret turned to leave. "If you want to control the story, Minister, keep your journalists better fed. Hunger makes them curious." Outside, the corridors felt colder. Lucas followed, half grinning in disbelief. "You've made an enemy there." Maigret shrugged. He was one already. By evening, the papers had changed their tone. Now the whispers grew darker. Talk of secret payments, of a witness vanished, of a police inspector who knew too much. When Maigret returned to his office, he found a letter waiting on his desk, unmarked, its envelope smudged with rain. Inside was a single sheet. "Stop asking about the umbrella. The river keeps its own counsel." There was no signature, no clue, but the faint scent of perfume, the same he had smelled that first morning in the alley. He held the paper to the light, his expression unreadable. Then he folded it once, twice, and slipped it into his pocket beside the umbrella's handle. The rain had begun again, steady and soft, like someone knocking at a door that would never open. He looked out across the river and said quietly, "All right then, let's see what the river has to say." The night had grown heavy, as if Paris were holding its breath. Rain fell in a fine mist that blurred the street lamps and softened the edges of the world. Inside the Quai des Orfèvres, the corridors were almost empty. Only the echo of Maigret's footsteps disturbed the stillness. He had stayed long past the hour when even the clerks had gone home, driven not by urgency, but by that quiet restlessness which comes when a case begins to breathe on its own. The letter lay open on his desk, the words, "The river keeps its own counsel," written in an elegant hand. He had read it a dozen times, not because he expected it to change, but because it seemed to contain more than it said. The perfume had faded, leaving only a faint trace of violets. The same scent he had noticed in Madame Gallet's drawing-room at Saint-Cloud, and on the gloves of the dead woman in the alley. Two women, linked by a man who claimed to be innocent, and now by a letter that had no right to exist. He drew on his pipe and watched the smoke rise and twist in the dim light. Below his window, the Seine moved like a thought he could not quite form. He imagined the river whispering beneath the bridges, carrying bits of memory, pieces of truth too heavy for men to hold. Somewhere in that current lay the rest of the story, and perhaps the confession he hadn't yet heard. A soft knock at the door broke the silence. It was Janvier, his coat still glistening from the rain. "Patron," he said quietly, "there's something you should see." They descended to the lower floor, where the night guard sat half asleep beside the switchboard. On the table lay a damp envelope. "It was delivered by hand," the guard said. "No messenger's mark." Maigret opened it carefully. Inside was a single page, written in the same hand as the earlier letter, but this time the ink was blotched as if the writer's hand had trembled. Inspector Maigret. "I can't bear the silence any longer. He didn't kill her, he loved her, but he couldn't save her. The guilt belongs to others, to men who will never stand trial. I have something that will explain everything. You'll find it where the fog meets the river, near the old barge by Pont-Marie. Midnight. Come alone." There was no signature, only the faint smear of a fingerprint in ink. Janvier frowned. "A trap?" "Perhaps," said Maigret. "But if it is, it's one I've been walking toward for days." He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket. "Go home, Janvier. And if I'm not back by morning, tell Lucas to search the river." The rain had eased by the time he reached the Pont-Marie, though the fog still clung low to the water. The lamps along the quay burned dim, their reflections trembling like wounded stars. He moved quietly, his shoes making little sound on the wet cobbles. Somewhere a church bell struck 12, each chime dissolving into the mist before the next began. The barge was still there, an old coal lighter, half sunk, used now by fishermen who kept their nets below deck. A single lantern hung at the prow, its light diffused through the fog. Maigret stopped at the edge of the quay, scanning the shadows. Then he saw her. Madame Gallet stood by the water, her coat drawn tight, her hat low over her brow. In the lamplight her face seemed carved from marble, pale and still. When she turned toward him, the gesture was slow, deliberate. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly. "You asked me to." "I didn't think you would." He approached until only the fog separated them. "Why here?" "Because it's where she died," she said. "Or near enough that it doesn't matter. I've been coming here every night since I heard." "Why write to me?" "Because I'm tired of watching men bury truth under manners." She reached into her coat and drew out a small parcel wrapped in oilskin. "These are her letters," she said. "The ones he hid from you." She wrote them to him, yes, but also to herself. They tell the story he wouldn't. Maigret took the bundle without speaking. The secret weight was slight, but it felt heavier than most evidence. And what story is that? That she was never blackmailing anyone. That she didn't care about the ministry or the money. She wanted only to protect him. But he wasn't the one in danger. She was. Someone in that building wanted her gone. Do you know who? Her eyes lifted toward the dark curve of the bridge. I know what she told me the night she came to Saint-Cloud. She said there was a man who had written her letters. Not Charles, another. Someone high enough to make a scandal fatal. She said he had promised her safety if she disappeared. And then she did. You're saying? I'm saying your ministry man isn't afraid of exposure. He's afraid of memory. She reminded him of what he was before the power and the money. She made him human again, and that frightened him more than ruin. Maigret watched her closely. And your husband? He covered for him, out of gratitude or guilt or both. He destroyed what evidence remained. He believed it would save them all. It didn't. The river lapped softly against the quay, patient as time. Why tell me now? He asked. Because he's gone. Maigret stiffened. Gone? She nodded. An hour ago I found him in his chair, empty bottle beside him. He left no note. The inspector closed his eyes briefly. The fog pressed closer, carrying the faint sound of a barge whistle far downstream. And you? I'm doing what he never could, letting it end. He reached out, but she stepped back, her heels at the very edge of the key. For a heartbeat, he thought she might fall, but she steadied herself and smiled, not in madness, but in release. "Don't worry, Inspector, I'm not one for melodrama. I'll go home now." He didn't believe her, but he didn't stop her either. He had learned that grief often needed to walk alone. When she vanished into the fog, he looked down at the bundle in his hands. The oilskin was slick, cold to the touch. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a dozen letters, each sealed but unaddressed. The top one was marked with a single initial. G. He broke the seal and read, "You once said the river forgives. I think you were wrong. It remembers everything we try to hide, but it also carries what we can no longer bear. If I go to it tonight, it won't be to die, only to unburden myself. I hope you understand." The handwriting was hers, steady, graceful, final. Maigret folded the letter again, slower this time, and slipped it into his coat. The fog thickened, swallowing the lantern's glow until it was only a dull pulse. Somewhere beneath the water, the current murmured, and he could almost hear it, forming words, not accusation, not absolution, just the quiet rhythm of truth finding its way through darkness. By the time he returned to headquarters, dawn had begun to stain the horizon. Lucas was waiting in the corridor, his face drawn. "Patron, they've found Gallet in his apartment." "I know," Maigret said softly. Lucas stared at him. "You knew?" "I was with his wife." Lucas hesitated, then asked, "What now?" Maigret's answer came like smoke dispersing. "Now we tell the truth, as much of it as anyone's willing to hear." He entered his office, closed the door, and sat. The city was waking outside, indifferent as always. He laid the letters on the desk, their envelopes pale against the dark wood. Each one seemed to breathe faintly, as if the words inside were alive. He didn't open them all, not yet. There would be time. There was always time for the dead. He leaned back, pipe between his teeth, and watched the light creep across the window. The Seine glimmered in the distance, calm now, as if its work were done. For the first time in days, Maigret felt the weight of fatigue settle over him. He thought of the woman's final words, "I'm not one for melodrama," and smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Somewhere below, a typewriter began to clatter, announcing another day's worth of reports, rumors, and official truths. He closed his eyes, hearing only the river, steady and endless, carrying with it the echoes of all that had been confessed, and all that never would be. It was almost midnight again when Maigret found himself alone at his desk. The gas lamps had been turned low, their light quivering on the surface of his glass ashtray, where several matches lay drowned like small, exhausted fish. Outside, the Seine whispered against the quay, and beyond that low sound the city murmured in its sleep. A handful of policemen remained in the building, their footsteps faint and irregular, the rhythm of a place that never truly rested. He had sent everyone home hours ago, Lucas, Janvier, even the clerk who insisted on staying late to file reports. The case was officially closing itself, or so the papers claimed. Former finance clerk found dead in apparent suicide. Mystery woman believed to be connected to ministry scandal. That was how the public would remember it, neatly tied, easily forgotten. But Maigret had never liked tidy endings. They smelled too much like compromise. The letters lay in a loose pile before him, the seals broken now, the words read and reread until they had lost their novelty but not their ache. The woman had written them as though each were a confession offered to no one in particular, to love, to guilt, to Paris itself. Her voice lived in the ink. He could almost hear her, low and calm, describing a man who had once dreamed of escape and instead had drowned quietly in the city's bureaucracy. Each letter circled the same truth: she had known too much and trusted too deeply. The danger wasn't in what she possessed, but in what she reminded others of. Conscience. He set his pipe aside and rubbed his eyes. The room felt close, heavy with smoke and thought. Somewhere in the corridor, a clock struck the half-hour. It was a comfort, that steady sound, proof that something in the world still kept order. A knock came at the door. Soft, uncertain, not Lucas, not one of his men. "Come in," Maigret said, his voice a gravelly whisper. The door opened, and a young officer entered, hat in hand. "Pardon, Inspector. There's a man outside asking for you. Says it's urgent." "Who is he?" "Didn't give a name. Says you'll know him." Maigret sighed, pushed back his chair and stood. "Show him in." The visitor stepped through the door with the quiet assurance of someone who did not belong here and knew it. His coat was of excellent cut, his gloves still damp from the night air. He looked like the kind of man accustomed to being listened to. Maigret gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Sit." The man did not remove his hat. "You've been busy, Inspector," he said softly, "but perhaps too curious for your own good. I've been called worse. You've been asking questions at the ministry, questions that have no proper answer." Maigret leaned forward slightly, elbows on the desk. "Then perhaps you should help me find one." The stranger smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't seem to understand, Inspector. The story is finished. There will be no more inquiries. The woman is dead. Gallet is dead. Their sins, whatever they were, died with them. The public is satisfied. So is the ministry. And you?" The man's smile faded. "I represent those who prefer quiet. That's a difficult preference in Paris. Not if one knows how to encourage it." Maigret let the silence linger. He studied the man's face, the faint scar beneath the chin, the controlled way he breathed, the slight accent that hinted of Brussels or Liège. Belgian, as the umbrella repairman had said. "You knew them both," Maigret said finally. The man's expression did not change. "I knew the world they lived in, a small world full of frightened people. The woman was foolish, the clerk weaker than he appeared. But none of this need concern you now." "It concerns me until it stops smelling like deceit." "Deceit?" The man laughed once, softly. "You're a romantic, Inspector. In my world, deceit is currency. We all spend it. The difference is who can afford to pay the interest." He stood, straightening his coat. "Let the river have them. It's better that way." Maigret rose too. "And if I don't?" The man's gloved hand brushed his hat brim. "Then I imagine you'll start seeing ghosts where there are only reflections. Good night, Inspector." He turned and left before Maigret could speak again. The sound of his footsteps faded down the corridor like water receding into drains. For a long time, Maigret stood staring at the closed door. The scent of the man's cologne lingered faintly. Sharp, unfamiliar, foreign. He knew the type. A messenger from power. One of those discreet errand men whose job was to turn murder into misfortune and truth into rumor. He sat again, slowly, and reached for his pipe. The tobacco had gone cold, but he relit it anyway, drawing the smoke deep. The visitor's words repeated in his mind. Let the river have them. He thought of the Seine, how it could carry everything and erase nothing. The river forgave no one, it merely accepted. He opened the top drawer of his desk and pulled out the first letter she had written, the one where she spoke of forgiveness and fear. He read it again, and as he did, he felt the presence of both the living and the dead crowding the room. Madame Galley, the woman in the alley, the clerk with the quiet hands, the minister with his polished lies, all of them seemed to breathe the same stale air. They were pieces of one pattern, but the picture remained incomplete. He rose and walked to the window. The river was visible again through the fog, its surface bruised by rainlight. He could see the Pont Marie in the distance, the same place where she had once stood, where so many had gone to speak with the water in secret. He wondered what she had whispered to it before she fell. Not a prayer, perhaps, but a memory. Behind him the door opened again. This time it was Lucas. His coat dripped onto the floor. "You're still here, patron?" Maigret didn't turn. "You ever think about the river, Lucas?" "Not often." "You should. It knows more about Paris than we do. It sees the same faces again and again, just under different names." Lucas hesitated. "You're not letting this one go, are you?" Maigret smiled faintly, the expression weary but alive. "When have I ever?" He returned to the desk, stubbed out his pipe, and began to write. The report would be long, too long for his superior's liking. But it would contain what mattered, the woman's letters, the truth about her love, the shadow of the ministry that no one dared name. He would leave out the visitor, of course. Some ghosts were safer, unrecorded. By the time he finished, dawn had begun to stir behind the clouds. He stood, stretched, and looked once more at the river. Its color had changed, lighter now, touched by the first hesitant gold of morning. The city was waking, and with it the endless machinery of forgetting. He slipped on his coat, tucked the letters under his arm, and left the office without a sound. Downstairs the clerk looked up in surprise. "Going home, Inspector?" Maigret paused at the door. "For a while," he said. "The river can watch the city without me." He stepped into the cold air, the fog curling around him like smoke. Somewhere a boat horn sounded, deep and mournful. As he walked along the quay, the water mirrored his figure, tall, solid, alone, and for a moment it seemed to nod in recognition. Paris would have its quiet again, but Maigret knew better. The city never truly slept. It only pretended to, waiting for the next whisper, the next forgotten name, the next body the river would keep for a while before giving back. He turned the corner toward home, the pipe between his teeth, the faintest smile on his lips. In the soft grey of the waking day, he looked less like a policeman and more like what he truly was. A man listening, always listening, for the story beneath the silence. The alley behind the Rue du Temple had not changed. Even after the days of rain and rumour, it held the same wet stone smell, the same reluctant light, the same narrow stubbornness that made footsteps slow without thinking. Morning had not yet found its colour. The sky hovered between tin and ash. Maigret stood at the mouth of the passage a long time with his hands in his pockets, as if waiting to be recognized. Places remember, he thought, not with words, but with the way air sits on the skin. The young patrolman who had first found the body nodded to him and moved away. There was nothing to guard now, except memory. He walked to where she had lain, the wall still scarred by a darker patch that rain could not persuade to wash away. He let his palm rest near the faint traces of the letters. 3 short strokes like the beginning of a name or a prayer. Perhaps it had been nothing, perhaps everything. In the gutter, a thin thread of water trickled, carrying the dust of the night toward the drain with patient resolve. He crouched, pipe unlit between his teeth, and stared at the stones until the alley's small conversations grew clear again, Water, distant cutlery from a kitchen window, a cat's invisible complaint. He rose and walked the length of the passage, counting without looking like a man reciting an old poem. At 5 paces from the corner, the cobbles dipped. At 7, the wall flared by 1 stone width where a mason had been careless years ago. At 9, the broken gutter dripped with the same obstinacy as on that first morning. He stopped there. The drop fell, and in between drops he heard another sound. Not now, but then. The damp rasp of fabric against stone, the bump of a shoulder, the short, shocked cry that men never hear because they expect screams and not the small, swallowed sound of surprise. He stepped back out to the street and crossed to the cafe. The windows steamed again. The bell still rang its thin chime. The proprietor looked older in the clearer light, as if the newspaper headlines had used him up. He poured without being asked, set the cup down, and waited with his hands flat on the zinc. "She came here before the alley," Maigret said, not questioning. The man nodded. She sat only a moment. Then she stood and stared at the clock as if it owed her something. When she left, she didn't look back. And he? Not the clerk. The other. The one with the careful coat and the shoes that didn't like the floor. He came later. He didn't sit. In the doorway. The proprietor lowered his eyes, as if to measure the room. "And me in it?" Maigret's gaze flicked to the mirror. His own hat hovered beside the reflection of the street. In the glass, the alley's mouth was a small, dark square like an unblinking eye. "You didn't tell me that." "I didn't remember," the man said, and there was no defiance in it, only resignation. "Not until last night." He put a coin on the counter and didn't take his change. Men who forget change remember other things. Outside, a boy with inked fingers pedalled past, yelling a headline that had already grown stale. The inspector finished his coffee slowly and left a coin under the saucer. As he lifted his hat, the doorbell chimed again, and Armand, the piano man, appeared like an afterthought of the room. He held his cap in both hands. "Inspector," he said, "I dreamed the song again. Only in the dream someone played with gloves on. The notes came muffled." "Gloves are for those who don't want to leave fingerprints," Maigret said without irony, and he stepped back into the morning. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the umbrella leaned against his desk, polished handle catching the reluctant light. He had placed it there deliberately, a quiet lodestar. The letters lay beneath a blotter, their voices now part of the air. He did not reread them. He had learned what he needed, not who, but how people live when they expect not to be chosen by mercy. He lit his pipe at last and sat until the room smelled properly of smoke and damp wool, as if the city itself had put on his coat. When the knock came, it was small, practiced, and unhurried. The knock of a man who belonged everywhere and nowhere. Roussel entered without waiting, the attaché's smile ready like a well-folded handkerchief. He removed his gloves 1 finger at a time and laid them upon the edge of the desk, as though they were a document he was willing to share. "You sent for me," he said. "I did," Maigret replied. He offered no chair. Roussel took one anyway and sat. His hair was arranged with a care that told the truth of his mornings. His face wore the kind of calm that is half exercise, half habit. "You paid for a journalist's dinner," Maigret said. "More than once." Roussel shrugged with a neatness that matched his tie. "Journalists must eat. The ministry believes in a well-fed press." "You also sent a letter without a signature to my desk." "Did I?" The perfume was the same as on the dead woman's gloves, the same as in Madame Gallet's drawing room. "You're clumsy when you're in a hurry." A flicker crossed the man's eyes. Not fear, Not anger, but a small irritation at being seen. "What is it you think you have, Inspector?" Maigret opened the drawer and took out nothing. He left the letters where they were. He had no wish to wave souls like flags. Instead, he placed the umbrella upon the desk between them, turning its handle so that the initials faced the light. "You sent someone to the umbrella?" "Repairer," he said. "Before that, you had an umbrella of your own repaired there." The man remembered the voice. "Belgian. Like the gentleman who visited me at night to advise quiet, the same handkerchief, the same cologne. Men like you are careful, but habits are stains that even rain does not wash out." Roussel's mouth twitched. "You think I stood in a dark alley and strangled a woman with my gloved hand because some clerk fell out of fashion? I think you walked after her when she left the cafe. You did not intend murder. Men like you rarely intend anything so vulgar. You intended to gather the frayed thread of your life before it caught on a nail. You asked for the letters you thought she carried. She had already given them away, not to you, not to Gallet, but to the place you cannot control. The river." He paused, letting the word cool in the room. "When she refused to be arranged like furniture, you tried to smooth her like a tablecloth. Your hand covered her mouth, or pressed her shoulder, or pushed too hard at the wrong angle. The wall did the rest. When you left, you told yourself it was accident. Accident is what civilized men call consequences." Roussel did not flinch. He had trained that out of himself years ago. "And what will you do with this poetry? Put it in a report? Lay it before a magistrate without proof? What you possess are feelings, Inspector. Feelings are smoke." Maigret relit his pipe without haste. "Smoke makes fire visible." He dropped the spent match into the glass ashtray and watched it hiss. "Proof? Very well. The cafe proprietor will recall your coin without change. The repairman will recall your voice. The guard at the ministry will remember that you left by the riverside gate on the night she died, umbrella under your arm though the rain had stopped. The concierge at her house will remember the man who stood under the arch and did not ring. Small proofs, perhaps, enough to summon you to a room you cannot talk your way out of. Not enough to put you in a cell unless your friends grow tired of spending themselves on your quiet." Roussel stared at the umbrella as if it might explain itself. "What do you want?" he asked at last, the words almost courteous. "Less noise," Maigret said. "Fewer letters like the ones that arrived on my desk. No journalist dinners for a while. No attachés whispering in corridors about inspectors who go soft. And a resignation placed on the right table, in the right handwriting, before the week is out. You will choose a paper with wide margins. The public appreciates white space around its decencies." Roussel's laugh was careful, dry. "You are very French, Inspector." "I am very tired," Maigret replied. They regarded one another a moment longer. Then the attaché stood, put on his gloves with the same delicate economy with which he had removed them, and reached for his hat. "If you had brought me an accusation," he said softly, "I would have fought you. But you have brought me a mirror. Men do not fight mirrors. They break them and cut themselves." He turned and left without offering a hand. The door closed like a sentence that did not require a period. When the room had absorbed his absence, Maigret carried the umbrella to the window and set it against the wall. Outside, the river was a long strip of tarnished silver. A barge pushed upstream with the implacable patience of things that cannot imagine failure. He stood there until his breath fogged the glass. Then he took the letters from the drawer and one by one slid them back into their oilskin wrapping. They did not belong to any of his reports. They belonged to the dead and to the living who would work hard to forget them. He walked once more to the alley. The patrolman had gone. The the street had resumed its modest traffic of deliveries and errands. A woman shook a rug from a window. Bread cooled on a sill. He leaned his back against the wall where her gloved hand had pressed and closed his eyes. The city's sounds rose and fell like the tide. He pictured her last steps again, not to torture himself with the obvious, but to honor the part of her no one had managed to confiscate. The decision to keep a single thing for herself at the end, even if it was only silence. A child crossed the alley with a hoop and stopped to look at him. "Monsieur, are you sick?" "No," Maigret said gently. "Just listening." "To what?" "To the stones." The child considered that, nodded as if adults were peculiar in ways that needed no explanation, and ran off, the hoop trundling after him like a small, obedient moon. He returned to the Quai des Orfèvres and wrote what he could write. Death in the passage behind Rue du Temple. Cause, asphyxia, under circumstances not incompatible with human pressure. Precise intent, indeterminable. He wrote no initials. He did not name Roussel or the Belgian whose voice lodged in the umbrella maker's memory. He wrote of a woman known as Mademoiselle Renard, likely a borrowed name, who had waited too long in a city that seldom answers. He mentioned the clerk's death without gallantry and appended a second document to a sealed file that would, he knew, find its way to a drawer that the next generation would inherit without opening. He did not mind. Paper has its own river. When the report was finished, he took his hat and coat and stepped into the corridor. The building's smell, ink, wool, rain, met him like an old relative. At the door he paused, struck by a sudden domestic urgency he recognized and trusted. The wish to be home before the soup cooled. He smiled at the thought. Madame Maigret would have set the table already, a small vase of flowers that had no right to be in season, reminding the room that kindness can ignore calendars. He crossed the Pont Marie with the slow, heavy ease of a man whose work is never finished and never late. The lamps were not yet lit, but the river carried their promises as clearly as if they were. On the parapet, he stopped and leaned his elbows on the cold stone. The water moved beneath him, patient and disinterested, a witness who could not be bribed. Somewhere near the bank, a fisher's line quivered. Somewhere beyond, a freight horn moaned long and low. He thought of the old phrase that had haunted the case. The river forgives, and shook his head. No, it remembers. And because it remembers, it allows men to pretend. That is its forgiveness. He turned away at last. The city gathered itself around him in the familiar way, a weight that never crushed, a sorrow that never asked for pity, a companionship made of fog and footsteps. As he walked, the alley behind the Rue du Temple settled into its place among the other alleys that had once loaned him their voices, not louder, not quieter, true. At the corner of his street he stopped to fill his pipe. The match flared and went out, then flared again, and the smoke rose into the first, faint blue of evening like a message that needed no address. He thought without melancholy of the names he did not know and of the ones he had preserved in his own untidy way. He would sleep, and in the morning the city would hand him another story that asked to be believed only as much as kindness required. That was enough. He went home,